Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 48. Merzifon.
Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening.
So last time, we discussed the Byzantine reconquest of swaths of Anatolia in the aftermath of the First Crusade. How following the catastrophic defeats at Iznik and Dorylaeum, Roman rule had been restored to the coasts of Anatolia and throughout most of the West. But also, how in response, a broad Turkish alliance had been formed. Led by Kılıç Arslan, whose own hubris was the cause of the disaster, I would note, this alliance of Turkish beys was now growing increasingly powerful, and they were determined to defend their new homelands. This then had stopped Emperor Alexios Komnenos from conquering more of Anatolia. And at Akşehir, the White City, the imperial armies turned back. The seeds of a reborn sultanate, and indeed of a remade Turkish Anatolia, had been planted. And today, we will see those green shoots begin to burst forth as the Turks rebound from their great defeats, but only after yet another fire. Because today, a new army of crusaders will appear in Anatolia, but this time with a far, far different result. So after the retreat of the emperor and the imperial armies from Akşehir, the Turkish beys finally had a chance to take a breath and look around at this new Anatolia. And Kılıç Arslan, at least, did not like what he saw. The invasion of the Crusaders and the war with the Byzantines had been a total catastrophe. Kılıç Arslan had started 1097 as the ruler of Western Anatolia, planning on conquering Malatya and dreaming of maybe taking over the whole of Anatolia and Syria. He ended 1098 holding nothing except a small patch of central Anatolia centered on Konya. Most of his royal treasury was gone, and his family was captive in Constantinople. In truth, his state had been basically destroyed. What a come-down, and one that was largely his own fault. But though the situation was dire, it was not hopeless. There were some things that were finally improving, even some silver linings to those dark clouds. For one thing, the Crusaders were safely off in the Middle East. They had taken Antioch and were on the path to take Jerusalem. From the standpoint of a pious Muslim, this was of course a total disaster. But from the self-interested standpoint of a Turkish bey in Anatolia, it meant that this massive army was now out of the way and unlikely to return. And the Roman advance in their wake had now also stopped. Yes, Western Anatolia was lost. Again, this was a total disaster. But the advance had at least been stopped by the alliance of the Turkish beys and the emperor's realization that he could not realistically push further. And this alliance among the beys was indeed a silver lining for Kılıç Arslan. By leading the war of resistance, he had saved not only his crown, but his head. Steppe leaders do not often survive the crushing defeats that he had endured, and the smart money after Dorylaeum was probably betting on his fall. But Kılıç Arslan had survived, likely in large part due to the legitimacy and military muscle created by being the man to organize the resistance. Indeed, his status as the leader of this broad Turkish alliance would now begin to provide the basis for the rebirth of the Sultanate. Thus, Kılıç Arslan settled into Konya. Once upon a time, this had been the second city of the Sultanate, where his brother Daoud had ruled. Now, it was virtually the only city of any meaningful size remaining to him. And indeed, Daoud now disappears from the history books, but his fate is unknown. Iznik, the first capital of the Sultanate of Rum, was gone, as were the lands of the West. Ankara was likely in the hands of a local bey who owed merely nominal allegiance to Kılıç Arslan, and at any rate, it was too close to the empire and the Danishmend Beylik. Kayseri was in ruins, and regardless, was almost certainly under Danishmend control at this point. Konya and the grasslands of central Anatolia were basically all that was left to the Sultanate. And even this is somewhat questionable. As I mentioned last time, on their return to the west, the two Crusader lords, Stephen of Blois and William of Grandmesnil, had passed through Konya in early 1098 without incident. So we can safely say that it was only by late 1098 at the earliest that Kılıç Arslan firmly took control of the city that would be the Sultanate's next capital. And indeed, it would not really firmly become a real capital until after 1101 and the events of this episode. Regardless of the timing of Kılıç Arslan's return to Konya, we know that it was in the winter of 1098 that a deal was struck between Kılıç Arslan and Alexios Komnenos for the return of Kılıç Arslan's family. Though we don't know the details, it seems that they were released without ransom. This incident is often presented by pro-Crusader sources as yet another Byzantine betrayal. The emperor releasing the family of the Sultan as part of a supposed Roman-Turkish alliance against the Latins. However, from our perspective, the Turkish perspective, the most important thing to note here is that Kılıç Arslan was negotiating with the emperor. In other words, that Kılıç Arslan still retained the power and the legitimacy to deal with the Roman state. That he was the leader of the Turkish alliance of beys. A sign of the strength that he was slowly rebuilding among the Turks, even after being almost destroyed. And though this is speculation on my part, I do wonder if the emperor now saw Kılıç Arslan and the weakened Sultanate as on some level preferable to the alternative, namely the Danishmends. He may well have believed that recognizing and dealing with the weakened sword lion was better than dealing with a strong Danishmend Beylik led by Gümüştegin Ghazi, the Silver Prince. And the Danishmends were indeed on the up and up. Really, they were now the top Turkish power in Anatolia. Their rise, potentially even over the line of Kutalmış, was something greatly feared by Kılıç Arslan. And though the two Turkish potentates remained allies against the Christians for now, conflict would eventually re-emerge between them. And it was now the Danishmend Beylik that was taking up the Ghazi mantle and leading the struggle against the Crusaders. After Gümüştegin's son Ismail Bey had driven the Byzantine general Gavras out of Bayburt and secured the Danishmend homeland in northern Anatolia, Gümüştegin himself set out to conquer Malatya. If you will recall, it had been a campaign against Malatya that had distracted Kılıç Arslan and caused him to send his troops to the east instead of defending his homeland against the Crusaders. Well now, in a sign of the change in relative strength between the Sultanate and the Danishmend Beylik, it was not Kılıç Arslan, but Gümüştegin Ghazi who was aiming to take the critical city. In early 1100, the Danishmend army rode down from Sivas towards Malatya, now ruled by an Armenian potentate named Gabriel, or Khoril in Armenian. The Armenian chronicler Matthew of Edessa relates, "In this year, the emir of the Persians, who was named Danishmend, came against the city of Malatya with a multitude of cavalry. He was the lord of Sivas and all the Byzantine lands in that area. He offered fierce battle against Malatya." Facing this Turkish onslaught and desperate for aid, Khoril reached out to none other than the Crusader leader Bohemund, ultimately setting off a chain reaction that would lead to a great battle between the Turks and the Crusaders at a place named Merzifon. So what have the Crusaders been up to? Well, after conquering Antioch in 1098, the Crusaders had stunned the world by taking Jerusalem in 1099. The Holy City was now back in Christian hands. The first Crusader states then began to take form. These were a patchwork of small lordships and kingdoms in the Levant run by the crusading leadership, collectively often called Outremer. By 1100, there were 3 of them, though others would shortly follow. In Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Jerusalem ruled by Godfrey of Bouillon. In Urfa, or Edessa, the Norman county of Edessa, ruled by Baldwin of Boulogne. And in Antioch, the first great city of the Middle East to fall to the Crusaders, there was the Norman Principality of Antioch, ruled by Bohemund. And this last Crusader state, ruled by Bohemund, was at the time extremely controversial, to put it mildly. If you'll recall, Emperor Alexios Komnenos had made all the Crusaders, including Bohemund, take an oath to restore to him any of the territory of the Roman Empire that they captured. Now, what this meant is a bit tricky to discern. Jerusalem, after all, had been part of the empire centuries earlier. Was that encompassed by the oath? Perhaps that was unclear. However, Antioch was not unclear at all. It had been Roman just before Manzikert. And now, instead of handing it over to the emperor, Bohemund was taking it for himself. Now, the Crusaders claimed that Alexios had broken the oath by basically not helping them take Antioch, both because he himself had turned back at Akshehir and because they believed that his subordinate, the Turkish Roman general Tatikios, had betrayed them before the walls of Antioch. Thus, they claimed, Antioch, along with all the regions they conquered in the east, was theirs, and not the emperor's. But this, of course, infuriated Alexios, who also remembered that Bohemund had previously invaded Byzantium itself. And this division between Alexios and Bohemund will play a critical role in our story going forward. So Bohemund, newly installed as the Lord of Antioch, was now holding a letter from Khoril in Malatya begging him for aid, and moreover, promising to submit to Bohemund's authority and turn the sovereignty of this incredibly important city over to the Norman Crusader and his new principality, if Bohemund would only just ride to his aid. According to some sources, Khoril even offered his daughter's hand in marriage. Being the aggressive adventurer that he was, Bohemund naturally jumped at the chance. If you'll recall, unlike many of the other Crusader lords, Bohemund had ridden east with the express aim of setting up his own kingdom there. He had indeed previously invaded the Byzantine Empire for that reason. His head had long been filled with dreams of Eastern conquest. So becoming Lord of Malatya was right up his alley. It would set him up to build a great Middle Eastern kingdom for himself. But by now, Bohemund had become overconfident. He had bested the Turks in battle numerous times, at Iznik and Dorylaeum, but also in the march across Anatolia and before the walls of Antioch. He would have been somewhat justified in becoming a bit complacent. Sure that his mighty Norman knights would be more than a match for the Danishmend Turks, led by Gümüştegin. He would turn out to be sorely mistaken. Thus, sometime in September 1100, Bohemund led an army out of Antioch northeast towards Malatya. According to Ibn al-Athir, the army was composed of 5,000 knights, so a somewhat sizable army for the time. However, Crusader sources mention a mere 300 knights. I think we can assume that the truth lies somewhere between them, but probably closer to 300 than 5,000. Joining him was the Lombard Crusader lord, Richard of Salerno, a fact that will come to be critical in what follows. The Armenian chronicler Matthew of Edessa implies that Bohemund was so confident of victory that he basically took no precautions, an inexcusable lapse of judgment. Then, behold, Bohemund and Richard foolishly came with no preparation. Their troops, moreover, were without fighting swords, and they came dressed in cloaks like women in a funeral procession, while their weapons of war were with their officials. These fighters, without their weapons, might have been captives. Hearing of the approach of the Norman army led by Bohemund and Richard, Gümüştegin Ghazi naturally took the proper course of action. As you would expect of any competent Turkish commander, he set up ambushes all along the roads and passes that this army would take on its way to Malatya. As the supremely overconfident Bohemund blithely marched his army towards the city, the Turks sprung the ambush, rushing down on the unprepared men. Matthew of Edessa relates what happened next. Suddenly, Danishmend's troops poured down upon the Franks' troops, and there was a frightful battle on that day. All the troops of the Franks and the Armenians were destroyed. Bohemund and Richard were taken captive. Thus, Gümüştegin Ghazi, the Silver Prince, won the first major Turkish and indeed Muslim victory against the Crusaders since the People's Crusade. The Normans had been bested in the field, and Bohemund and Richard were packed off to Niksar, a town in northern Anatolia near one of the Danishmend capitals at Amasya. Finally, someone had managed to defeat the infidel. And perhaps even more shockingly, the most renowned and feared of all the Crusader lords, Bohemund, was now a prisoner of the Turks. Matthew of Edessa, who was actually a contemporary, writes of the effect of the news of the Battle of Malatya. Hearing news about this defeat, the entire house of the Christians quaked with fear, while the entire nation of the Persians rejoiced. Internally, among the Turks and within the Turkish alliance led by Kılıç Arslan, this great victory by the Silver Prince no doubt enhanced the prestige of the Danishmends. Indeed, if you look at it objectively, the Danishmends had done far more than the Sultanate in the struggle with the Crusaders. Kılıç Arslan's hubris had allowed the infidel to gain victory at both Iznik and Dorylaeum, where Kılıç Arslan's own family and treasury had been taken. But the Danishmends had performed well in battle, and it had been Ismail, the son of Gümüştegin, who had campaigned against Gavras and perhaps even forced the emperor of the Romans to retreat, if Ana Komnena is to be believed. And though our sources don't really speak about this in detail, the success of the Danishmends no doubt caused tensions within the Turkish alliance, specifically between the Danishmends and the Sultanate of Rum. Why should the Silver Prince listen to the Sword Lion? What has he done to deserve the exalted position he claims? This was in fact a very good question. and these tensions between these leading Turkish potentates would, in time, boil over. And it would turn out that this great victory of Gümüştegin Ghazi and the Danishmends would set the stage for yet another victory, an even greater one, but one that would, almost paradoxically, cement Kılıç Arslan's position among the Turks and enable the consolidation of power by the Sultanate of Rum, because the news of the capture of Bohemund and Richard of Salerno coincided with the arrival of yet more crusaders from the west, and provided the Sword Lion with a chance for a do-over of a sort. See, as the incredible news of the fall of Jerusalem spread back to Europe, the news of the redemption of the Holy Land where Jesus himself had tread, it of course led to great celebrations and a new burst of crusading vigor. They had been right. God had been on their side. And thus the new pope, Paschal II, ordered a new crusading army to be raised. This army would head east to secure the new conquest and, God willing, conquer further. I mean, surely it was the will of God that the great conquest continue, right? This new crusade had a large contingent of crusaders who had either gotten cold feet right before the First Crusade or had abandoned the journey and were now looking for redemption. It is therefore often called the Crusade of the Faint-Hearted. But it was also composed of a large number of Lombard forces, leading it to often being called the Lombard Crusade. These Lombards had departed Milan in northern Italy in September 1100, so at the exact same time that Bohemund and Richard of Salerno were being defeated and captured at Malatya. And remember, Richard was himself a Lombard. So when the Lombard Crusade showed up in Constantinople over the winter of 1100 to 1101, they were told that their fellow Lombard, Lord Richard of Salerno, had been captured and was in chains in Niksar along with the great Bohemund. Upon hearing the news, they decided that they wanted to go rescue the prisoners along their way to the Holy Land, and they soon set to work trying to convince their fellow crusaders. In the meantime, they of course also took part in one of the great pastimes of the Crusaders, pillaging the land around Constantinople to the great fury of the emperor. Alexios, horrified by the violence and theft that these unwashed barbarians were perpetrating near his capital, rushed them off to Izmit and waited anxiously for the rest of the barbarians to arrive. When the next batch of crusaders, mostly French, Burgundian, and German, got there, Alexios hurried them on to Izmit and confirmed Raymond of Toulouse as their commander. Alexios was so eager to get these crusaders out of his city and its environs that he sent them off before further contingents of French crusaders under William of Nevers and William of Aquitaine arrived. And Alexios also dispatched with them a contingent of Turcopole warriors, perhaps of Pecheneg origin. If you'll recall, the Turcopoles were the sons of Greek-Turkish unions, Greeks who were raised by the Turks before being recaptured, or Turks captured in their youth and turned into soldiers for Byzantium. In essence, Turkish soldiers who fought for the empire. Sometimes you need steppe warriors to fight steppe warriors. These Turcopoles were led by a general named Chitas, who would serve as both a commander and a liaison officer. In May 1101, this crusade departed from Izmit following the same route taken by the First Crusade. They swung by Iznik, which was now of course a Roman city again, before coming to Eskişehir, where a mere 4 years earlier, the armies of Kılıç Arslan were defeated on the plains of Dorylaeum. But from here, this crusade broke with the route taken by the First Crusaders. Following great debates led by the Lombards about rescuing Bohemund and Richard, the fateful decision was made on June 9, 1101. It seems that Chitas and the other crusaders reluctantly agreed to take Ankara and restore it to the empire, but still hoped that after that they would march south and not deeper into northern Anatolia to rescue Richard and Bohemund. The Crusaders arrived at Ankara in June 1101. Ankara was now held by nothing more than a small Turkish garrison of about 200 soldiers. The city was then a far cry from the capital of the Republic that it is today. It was indeed nothing more than a hilltop castle, with a small town clinging to the slopes descending from the top. The small Turkish garrison in Ankara basically had no chance of defeating the thousands of crusaders, and fell on June 23, 1101. As Ibn al-Athir relates, they came to a castle called Ankara, which they took, killing the Muslims there. According to Albert of Aachen, it only took the better part of a morning for the Crusaders to take the fortress and kill all but 6 of the defenders. But now the dispute among the Crusaders boiled over. The Lombards were determined to rescue their countryman, Richard of Salerno, along with Bohemund, while the Burgundians, French, and German Crusaders were eager to travel to the Holy Land. Eventually, the Lombards were finally able to prevail upon the others, and thus the crusading army departed from Ankara, traveling not to the south, but to the east, towards Niksar and the lands of the Danishmends, where the 2 great crusader lords were imprisoned. But this time, things would not go the way the crusaders wanted, because Kılıç Arslan was determined to not allow himself to be caught with his pants around his ankles a second time. He had been incredibly and unforgivably delinquent the last time a Western army had arrived in Anatolia, and he was not going to let that happen again. As soon as he heard reports of the Crusader army massing in Izmit, Kılıç Arslan sprang into action. As Matthew of Edessa writes, Kılıç Arslan, having heard about the arrival of the Frankish troops, wrote to Danishmend, the emir of Niksar, and to the other emirs. Assembling an enormous multitude, he came against the Frankish troops. The broad alliance that had been built among the Turkish beys in the immediate aftermath of the First Crusader invasion mobilized, and Kılıç Arslan immediately set to work organizing a response. This alliance, of course, included the smaller beys of Anatolia, most of whom are unfortunately unknown and unnamed. But it was based around 3 key potentates. Firstly, Kılıç Arslan himself and the forces of the Sultanate, now based in Konya and the grasslands of Cappadocia and central Anatolia. Secondly, Gümüştegin Ghazi and the Danishmend Beylik, based in northern Anatolia, with its capitals at Amasya and Sivas. And third, in northern Syria, Rızvan of Aleppo. Rızvan was a Seljuk prince, a son of Tutush, and thus, on some level, had even bluer blood than his distant cousin Kılıç Arslan, because he was of the superior line of Çağrı. After Tutush fell in battle against Berkyaruk in his struggle to claim the throne of the great Seljuk Empire, his Syrian heartland was taken over by his 2 sons, Rızvan in Aleppo and Dukak in Damascus. But conflict predictably broke out between them, and Rızvan, searching for allies, turned to his cousin in Anatolia, Kılıç Arslan. Thus, Rızvan of Aleppo was brought into the alliance. As the Crusaders marched east and north from Ankara, these great Turkish armies began assembling and converging on northern Anatolia. In July 1101, the Crusaders attempted to take the fortress of Çankırı, just to the east of Ankara, but were forced to give up. The citadel and the local terrain was simply too formidable, and the Turkish garrison too strong, though they did, of course, take the opportunity to pillage and burn the surrounding countryside. We cannot say for sure whether the local bey ultimately owed loyalty to the Sultanate or to the Danishmends, but based on the Danishmend Name, an admittedly biased source, it does appear that Danishmend overlordship is more probable. Failing to take Çankırı, the army began marching north, making for the city of Kastamonu. Kastamonu lies just inland from the Black Sea, where the Pontic Alps rise up between the plateau and the sea. It was an ancient city with a formidable castle, and indeed was the city from which Emperor Alexios' family, the Komnenoi, originally hailed. Now, though, it was under Danishmend sovereignty. And it was while the Crusaders were marching to Kastamonu that finally the armies of the Great Turkish Alliance, assembled and led by Kılıç Arslan, finally arrived. Kılıç Arslan led the armies of this Grand Turkish Alliance into northern Anatolia in July 1101, and he adopted the same strategy as he had after Dorylaeum. Scorched earth tactics coupled with relentless Turkish guerrilla warfare. The riders did what they were famous for, harrying the plodding column of knights, striking quickly and then disappearing. Albert of Aachen relates several skirmishes as the Turks launched lightning attacks on the marching army, and Ana Komnena records, "But the Turks, long practiced in war, seized all the villages and food supplies and burnt them, and when they caught up with the Normans, they attacked them all at once." Ultimately, this led Raymond of Toulouse to order that the Crusader army march in more compact groups to stop the Turks from picking off smaller detachments. Several sources claim that the Byzantines began to secretly cooperate with the Turks, deliberately leading them into areas that had been despoiled and even denying them supplies. Of course, the Crusader scholar Albert of Aachen and the eyewitness Eckhard of Ora make these claims, but somewhat surprisingly, so does the Armenian chronicler Matthew of Edessa. And there is a logic to this. Constantinople had every reason to be angry with these Crusaders. They had ravaged the countryside of Constantinople, and now they wanted to free Bohemond. Remember, Bohemond had been ruling in Antioch in defiance of Emperor Alexios, and it is fair to say that these two men deeply detested each other. Almost certainly, more than either of them hated their Muslim opponents. Even now, Alexios was preparing for an invasion to retake Antioch from the Normans, and he very much did not want Bohemond to be freed from prison in Niksar. But that said, this allegation of direct cooperation between the Byzantines and the Turks against the Crusaders does not really appear to be correct, or at least it is overblown. Ana Komnena and Albert of Aachen do both confirm that Alexios and Chitas advised the Lombards strongly against this march, but that they were overruled. And the rumors of withheld supplies or of being deliberately led along the wrong route do not seem to be true. Nevertheless, there is a kernel of truth in these allegations, in that the Byzantines were on much more familiar terms with the Turks than the Crusaders were, and were capable of engaging in contact and diplomacy that the Westerners saw as treacherous. It is also apparent from the Crusader accounts of the cities that they encountered on the march that many of the local Greeks were totally fine with living under Turkish military rule, a testament to the extent to which the Beyliks really were joint Turkish-Roman projects. This was seen as more evidence of treachery by the Crusaders, of course. And even when the local Greeks welcomed the coming of the Crusaders, they were still often brutalized. Reportedly, at one town, the local priests came out to greet the army wearing their ceremonial robes and carrying crosses and Bibles, but they were then all slaughtered by the crusading army. Incidents like this made many of the local Greeks prefer Turkish overlordship, a forerunner of the widely held Greek sentiment during the Ottoman era encapsulated by the saying, "Better the Turkish turban than the Latin mitre." So while it is unlikely that Kılıç Arslan and Alexios Komnenos were in league at this point in 1101, based on later events and their later alliance, it is likely that feelers were being put out between Constantinople and Konya, and also that the emperor would not be entirely distraught if this crusading army met its end without freeing his hated enemy, Bohemund. Thus the Crusaders marched through the mountains of northern Anatolia, becoming steadily weakened. They faced constant Turkish harassment as Turkish contingents picked off detachments of knights in lightning hit-and-run attacks. And as their supplies ran low, the men began to starve. Albert of Aachen writes, "Then for 15 successive days they continued their journey, going further into the deserts and inhospitable and dreadful places, through very rough mountainous regions where they found nothing, not a man, not a beast." Always the Turks shadowed their prey, and when the Crusaders sent forth foraging parties, they were invariably destroyed. Finally, after weeks of marching, the Crusaders approached Kastamonu. But Kılıç Arslan and the Turkish army did not let up. As the Crusaders began to scour the region for supplies, the Turks struck. Turkish scouts located a group of 1,000 or more Crusader infantry attempting to forage unripened barley and fruits from the fields near Kastamonu. The Turks thereupon surrounded the fields, encircled the men, and lit the fields alight. The flames rushed in, burning 1,000 Crusaders to death, and those who escaped the fire were picked off by Turkish arrows. Absolutely brutal stuff. Following this incident, the Crusader leadership decided that Kastamonu could not be taken. They instead turned to the east, still hoping to rescue Richard and Bohemund. The leader of the crusade, Raymond of Toulouse, again ordered a tight formation and cut down the number of foraging parties. Only in this way did he believe he could save his army from the Turks. But this also meant that supplies, already low, were not really going to be replenished. If you can't send foraging parties out, you can't really forage supplies, of course. And thus, the Crusaders continued to starve. For 6 days, the crusading army miserably trekked through the mountains of northern Anatolia, finally coming to a place named Merzifon. Merzifon is a town in the mountains of northern Anatolia. It lies in a small valley, less than 100 kilometers inland from Samsun, and just 40 kilometers from Amasya, one of the Danishmend capitals. And it was here that the Turkish alliance led by Kılıç Arslan decided to make their stand and finish the foreign invader. Albert of Aachen writes that as the crusading army entered the valley of Merzifon, in the way of the Christian hordes stood the Turks Danishmend, Suleiman, by which he means Kılıç Arslan, Karageth, an otherwise unknown bey, Rizvan of Aleppo, and men from the mountains of Paphlagonia and all the kingdom of Antioch, and 20,000 archers, armed with bows of horn and wood. As the hungry and bedraggled Crusader army made its way through the passes and into the valley, they desperately scrambled to make camp on the evening of a Friday in early August 1101. The Turkish army immediately launched a devastating assault. Albert of Aachen writes that the Turks charged into the camp with a sudden rush, transfixed with arrows the Christian soldiers who challenged them. But this assault was not to be the main encounter. It was merely the appetizer. Kılıç Arslan instead withdrew the Turkish armies and set about cutting off the enemy's access to the outside world. Over the course of the night of Friday and the morning of Saturday, the Turkish army encircled the Crusaders. All passes in and out of the valley were guarded, and the Crusaders were bottled up and trapped. As the reality of their situation dawned on them, the Crusaders began contemplating how to break out of the tightening noose that the sword lion had slipped around their neck. On Saturday, a Crusader contingent led by the German princes Conrad and Bruno attempted to take a small Turkish fortress in the mountains between the valley and the Black Sea to the north. Hopefully, this would open up an exit and enable the trapped army to flee to the coast, which was controlled by the Empire. From there, they could escape by sea back to Constantinople. Initially, this assault on the fortress seems to have worked fairly well. Albert of Aachen writes, "The Turks tried in vain to defend it. They quickly broke it down, seized all the vital provisions which were inside, and put to the sword the Turks they found within." But as this German army began to march to the passes to secure an exit route to the sea, they were quickly set upon by the Turks. Clearly, Kılıç Arslan and the other leaders of the alliance dispatched troops to the area upon hearing of the assault on the fortress. Reportedly, the Germans were so exhausted that they barely put up a fight. Over 700 died, and all the looted provisions were retaken. The survivors retreated back to the Crusader camp, bearing news that the attempt to fight their way out had failed. The next day, Sunday, was reportedly quiet. The Crusaders sat glumly in their camp, surveying their rapidly shrinking options, while the sword lion, Gümüştegin Ghazi, Rizvan of Aleppo, and the other Turkish leaders began to prepare their troops for the final battle. I imagine Kılıç Arslan spending the day and night praying desperately that Monday would not bring another Iznik or Dorylaeum. Finally, the sun dawned on Monday. In the Crusader camp, the Bishop of Milan reportedly led the men in prayer and performed last rites. And in the hills and fields of Merzifon, Kılıç Arslan ordered the Turkish armies to commence the assault. The Turkish army rushed in towards the Crusader camp. They found that the Lombards had been placed in the vanguard and engaged them with the classic tactics of the steppe. Albert of Aachen writes, "The Turks cunningly, and from their experience in battle, suddenly reined in their horses after a short flight and renewed the hail of arrows, and they destroyed horses and men alike with severe wounds." The Turkish charge and the withering arrow fire appear to have quickly broken the Lombards, many of whom were by now infantry and were weakened by hunger. The Lombard vanguard soon began to break and flee. Seeing this, the German Prince Conrad led a counterattack. This failed, as did similar counterattacks led by Stephen of Blois and Stephen, the Duke of Burgundy. Even with a numerical advantage, the weakened and starving Crusader forces were simply no match for the Turkish riders. Kılıç Arslan ordered further waves of assault as the crusading army began to break. In one last desperate attempt, the leader of the crusade, Raymond of Toulouse, took command of the Byzantine Turkopole warriors and attempted a counter-assault. The counter-assault saw some of the most vicious fighting of the Battle of Merzifon, as Raymond attempted to break the Turks in one final charge. Albert of Aachen records, "But then events turned very much against him, and very many of his men were brought down and defeated by arrows, and the Turks' attacks grew much stronger, until all the Turkopole army was terrified and fled back to the place of the tents, deserting the Count in the midst of the danger, and almost all his Provençal soldiers were cut to pieces." With this last counter-assault a failure, the crusading army began to completely break down. As his enemies broke and routed, Kılıç Arslan ordered the Turkish armies to descend and annihilate them. With the Crusaders descending into chaos, the Turks rode in and mass butchery took place, the Turks even dispatching their enemies by hand. Ana Komnena records, "The Turks had them in their power, and therefore no longer fought with spears or arrows, but drew their swords, and made battle hand to hand, and soon routed the Normans." The Turkish victory was total. Even some of the Crusader leaders were killed, though Raymond of Toulouse and several others were able to escape through the rugged mountain passes to the sea, where they would eventually board Byzantine ships back to Constantinople. The rest fell victim to the Turks as they plundered the Crusader camp. The Turks killed or enslaved them all, and many of the women in the Crusader camp were raped before being carried off for a life of servitude, which almost certainly would continue to involve rape, which Albert of Aachen dwells on in particularly lurid detail. He also goes on to say, "They spared none for age or rank, taking prisoner only beardless youths or men of military office, whom they also marked to be carried off into exile in Khorasan with the honorable matrons." The Battle of Merzifon was a turning point. The first time that a large army of skilled and professional crusading knights had been defeated by the Turks. Yes, the People's Crusade had been massacred, but they were untrained peasants. And yes, Gümüştegin Ghazi had defeated Bohemund at Malatya, but that was a small and extremely unprepared, overconfident expeditionary force. At Merzifon, a massive army of skilled and experienced crusaders had been completely annihilated by the Turkish alliance led by Kılıç Arslan. A sign of what the Turks could do when they took the invasion seriously and united. Indeed, one wonders what the world would look like if Kılıç Arslan had done in 1097 what he did in 1101. If Merzifon could have been inflicted on the First Crusaders instead of Iznik and Dorylaeum on the Turks. But Merzifon was not yet the end of the war, and Kılıç Arslan had no chance to rest and savor his victory. Because as the Grand Turkish Alliance was destroying the Crusaders at Merzifon, yet more Crusaders were marching across Anatolia. Two smaller French detachments, respectively led by William of Navarre and William of Aquitaine, were making their way across the plateau by a southern route. Like the other Crusaders, they had taken the time to pillage the region around Constantinople before being hurried along by Alexios, who had earlier rushed the original Lombard Crusaders into Anatolia before these two Williams arrived because they had done like the exact same thing. The armies of the two Williams were passing along the same route as the Lombard Crusader army, except that after coming to Ankara, they turned south to continue to the Holy Land. Though smaller than the army that met its end at Merzifon, both of these armies were fairly large but were unable to link up with each other during the march across Anatolia. Therefore, basically immediately after winning the great victory at Merzifon, the Turkish army led by Kılıç Arslan decamped from northern Anatolia and began rushing to defeat these two French armies in the south. It was clear that these crusaders were aiming for Konya, the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, on their way across Anatolia. Having defeated the initial crusading force at Merzifon, a mere 40 kilometers away from one of the Danishmend capitals, the forces of the Turkish alliance now raced to defeat these new armies before they could reach the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. Thus, as the army of William of Navarre approached Konya, they were suddenly overtaken by a massive Turkish army. Albert of Aachen reports that the army was led by none other than Kılıç Arslan and Gümüştegin Ghazi. The great Turkish army had traversed a distance of about 400 kilometers in 6 days, a truly shocking pace. As before, Kılıç Arslan ordered ambushes set and skirmishing parties sent forth, trying to wear down the enemy before they reached his capital. Albert of Aachen relates that the Turks moved swiftly along known paths in the hills and valleys and met them, and attacked them cruelly with arrows. They wore out the army within 3 days by setting ambushes before and behind, by intense battle and bitter wounds. Reportedly, they even managed to kill a Lombard count. And remember, the Anatolian plateau is extremely hot and dry in the summer, and thus the Crusaders were becoming increasingly thirsty. As they trudged across the baking heat of the plateau, men and animals began to drop dead from thirst as the Turks continuously harried the crusading army. However, though the Crusaders were weakened by this constant attack, Kılıç Arslan was not able to destroy them before they reached the walls of his capital. Previously, crusading armies had found Konya unguarded. They entered the city without opposition and joyfully drank their fill after the grueling march across the baking hot and dry grasslands that make up the center of the Anatolian plateau. Not this time. This time, the French Crusaders found Konya garrisoned by a Turkish army. The forces of the Sultanate were ready to defend what was now to be the capital of their state. With Kılıç Arslan and Gümüştegin Ghazi circling on the plains outside the city, the defenders inside put up a heroic fight as a brutal struggle for the city commenced. The parched Crusaders, desperate for relief after the march across the plateau and the brutal assaults of the Turks, stormed the walls. Albert of Aachen writes, "They attacked the ramparts strongly. The enemy inside fought back for their lives until very many were killed on both sides." But ultimately, the Crusaders were unable to break the city. As night fell, they gave up on the assault and withdrew to the east, making for the city of Heraclea, modern-day Ereğli. Konya had survived. In Ereğli, the parched Crusaders searched desperately for water, but none could be found because Kılıç Arslan had sent ahead a Turkish force to lay waste to the town and despoil the wells. As before, the Sword Lion was prepared to ruin the land to stop the foreign invader. Reportedly, the Crusaders entered the town but found it empty of people and with not one well in operation. But they had only a short amount of time to worry about this because basically immediately upon their arrival in Ereğli, they were set upon by the Turks. Overcome by thirst and exhaustion, there was simply no way for the Crusaders to withstand the furious assault that Kılıç Arslan unleashed upon them. Albert of Aachen says, "They filled up the entire very wide valley with their blood, and the ground of this region was thickly strewn with the corpses of killed men and women." The parched Crusaders basically didn't stand a chance, and the army was essentially slaughtered to a man. Only William of Navarre himself and a handful of his companions managed to escape, fleeing south through the Taurus Mountains and into Cilicia. And the Turks, of course, plundered the camp of the massacred Crusaders, taking, in Albert of Aachen's words, thousands of wives of Christian soldiers. He adds that horses, mules, gold and silver, even their garments of every precious kind were seized and carried off, incredible and uncountable riches increased, and filled the land and kingdom of Khorasan with very great wealth and plunder. The Turkish alliance, led by Kılıç Arslan, had now annihilated the Second Great Crusader army. Only one more remained in the field, the force led by William of Aquitaine, which was now itself approaching Konya. But though the garrison at Konya had performed well and had withstood the might of the French Crusaders under the first William, Kılıç Arslan must have now calculated that it could not withstand yet another assault. With a heavy heart, he ordered the garrison to abandon the city, opening it up for the Crusaders to enter unopposed as he plotted his next move. This would be the last time in history that a Christian army would march unopposed into Konya, though as we will eventually see, unfortunately, it would not be the last time a Christian army would enter the city. But Kılıç Arslan did more than order the garrison to leave the city. Remember that Konya's chief value to the Crusaders was its water. This was the first city you encountered after leaving the hot and dry center of the plateau. It was where armies could rest and recover before continuing their journey. And so, in what was an act of true self-sacrifice and the culmination of his scorched earth policy, Kılıç Arslan grimly ordered that the wells and cisterns of the city of Konya be broken and clogged up. And furthermore, the Sword Lion ordered the fields of grain surrounding Konya to be burned to the ground. The crusading army under William of Aquitaine would find no relief as they entered his capital. No water, no bread, nothing. Even his own capital, the last great city remaining to his sultanate, would be sacrificed at the altar of victory if it meant winning the war. Thus, when the army of William of Aquitaine dragged themselves into Konya, parched from thirst and with all their supplies consumed, they were heartbroken to find nothing to slake what Albert of Aachen calls their unbearable thirst and their severe famine. Without water or supplies to be found, the crusading army unhappily trudged out of the city, making for a place they had been assured water and supplies could be found. Ereğli, the very same place where Kılıç Arslan, Gümüştegin Ghazi, Rizvan of Aleppo, and their combined Turkish armies had just massacred the forces of William of Navarre. As William of Aquitaine's army began marching towards Ereğli, Kılıç Arslan assembled the armies of the Turkish alliance. Eventually, the Crusaders came upon the river that flows near Ereğli, near a place that Matthew of Edessa calls the Plains of Oloso. But as they rushed forward to quench their thirst, the Crusaders saw arranged on the banks of the river a great Turkish army. Albert of Aachen says it was led by Kılıç Arslan, Gümüştegin Ghazi, and two beys who he calls Karatix and Agimith, and whose names are unfortunately otherwise unknown. He writes that the Turks charged the heedless Crusaders, using bows and arrows to prevent the men, horses, and all the pack animals from watering, until the Christians, wearied by the long journey and worn out by thirst, could no longer withstand their strength. As the disorganized Christians attempted to fight along the river, likely stooping to quench their thirst as arrows rained in on them, a vicious and long battle commenced. For a whole day, the river became a scene of absolute carnage as the Turks encircled the Crusaders, who fought on in the marshy banks of the river until they could no longer resist. Eventually, the crusading army broke and was routed. As his enemy fled, Kılıç Arslan ordered a full assault, and the Turks rode forward to cut them down. only William of Aquitaine and his fellow general Welf survived, along with a handful of their men, though Welf was mortally wounded by an arrow and would shortly die in agonizing pain in Cilicia. As their men were slaughtered along the river and in the nearby fields, they made for the mountains to the south to make an escape to the lands of Outremer. Matthew of Edessa writes, "When William saw the destruction of his forces, he went up onto a mountain. The foreigners surrounded the foot of the mountain. There one could hear the crackling sound of bows, the tramping of horses' hooves, and the mountains themselves reverberating with the sounds of battle. When William saw the destruction of his troops, he wept bitterly." Thus, the third and last of the great crusading armies of 1101 was destroyed. Like the others, it had been utterly annihilated by the Turks. The two battles of Ereğli would join Merzifon among the greatest victories of Kılıç Arslan. Indeed, the greatest victories. Because it was here, in destroying the Crusade of 1101, that Kılıç Arslan saved his sultanate. This was the vindication, the revenge for his failures during the First Crusade, though in truth, nothing could ever really make up for what he had lost through his hubris in 1097. The Latins were put on notice. They would not again have the advantages that they had enjoyed in 1097. The Turks were ready for them and were willing to fight. And when they did fight, when the Latin knights from the west met the horse archers in the field, the Turks were more than capable of destroying them. This first great victory of the Muslims over the Crusaders in 1101 would serve as a rebuke and a reminder that God is not necessarily on the side of the Christians. But more importantly, it was in organizing and leading this war, in building and commanding the alliance that achieved victory, that Kılıç Arslan's position was secured. This was the way in which the Sultanate would again assert its supremacy over the other beys and centralize the power of the Sultanate of Rum. Indeed, centralize power to an extent that had not been achieved prior to the Crusades. Leading the war and leading the Turks to victory was how the dynasty of Kutalmış would cement its power and build again, from scratch, a sultanate. And as part of this project, it was also here, in these wars against the Crusaders and the Byzantines, that the Ghazi ideology, the ideology of jihad, would come to form a key pillar of the regime's new legitimacy. The leaders of the Turks in their holy war against the infidel invader. And so next time, we will discuss how the Sultanate of Rum rose again from the ashes. But we will also see how the tensions within the alliance between the Danishmends and Kılıç Arslan would boil over as Kılıç Arslan attempts to further centralize the power of the Sultanate of Rum. And we will finish the story of the other great Turkish potentate of these first wars against the Crusaders, Gümüştegin Ghazi, the Silver Prince.